Video for the Korean Grammar for Topic series. The reason for this video is to give a brief overview of the series and why it exists, and also to give some tips that I really wish that I'd been given when I first started, or even better, before I started learning Korean, because they would have made my life a hell of a lot more easy. All right, let's get straight into it. So the reason for this series and what it'll cover is Korean grammar from beginner up to advanced. And the reason is because it's been created from a non-native speaker's point of view. And why this is important is Korean grammar and English are very different to each other. So if you have a native speaker teaching you Korean, it's a lot more difficult to understand some of the grammar bits, because much in the same way in English you use a lot of things grammatically correctly every single day, and they're automatic. And if someone asked you to explain them, you'd have a lot of difficulty explaining them, and you probably even have even more difficulty understanding why somebody else doesn't get some of those things, because they're just so automatic. And the same thing happens with Korean. So a Korean native speaker might not fully understand like what those things are that you are going to find hard, if you understand where I'm coming from. So this series is written and created by a non-native speaker to explain things in a way that are more likely to resonate more quickly with you. And I guess the sentence I use to explain this is an in order to statement. And it's much in the same as English. There's two clauses. There's a reason clause and then there's an action clause. So the sentence, I went to the sea in order to go swimming, when put in Korean is 수영하기 위해 바다에 갔어요. Now, if you directly translate the words from Korean into English, you get swimming in order to, sea, went to. Now, what the difficulty with this is, and this sentence in particular is, the in order to goes in the middle of the sentence, which is no change to English, but the reason clause comes before the action clause. And this can be a hard thing to grasp. However, how I learnt to get this sentence right really quite easily was to switch up the way I said the English sentence. So now, instead of saying, I went to the sea in order to go swimming, I will say in English, in order to go swimming, I went to the sea. What this then means is, because of the way you've now said it in English, you train yourself to think, okay, the reason goes first, then the in order to piece of grammar, and then lastly I finish off with the action clause. And it becomes a really quite simple thing to be able to do, rather than someone just telling you, in order to, this is in order to, this is the bit of grammar, off you go. All right, so moving on to the tips section of this video. The first tip that I've got is to create a grammar book. And what you see on the screen there is an image taken from my grammar book. The reason this is so useful is it allows you to revise very quickly and very easily. So in short, you open up the book, pick one of the grammar bits that you're not 100% confident with, look at it, understand it because you've written the explanation in terms that make sense to you, and then you use other vocab you've learnt, plug it into it, and then practice sentences from it. So it makes that revision of the grammar a lot more simple. So what I recommend when it comes to this book then is, each time you learn a new grammar rule, write it in the book in a way that makes sense to you, if that makes sense. So rather than just copying verbatim out what somebody else has said this grammar rule means, write it in words that make sense to you and explain this grammar rule like as you would. As once again, this makes it easy to learn. This means you're more likely to retain it and also to be able to use it. All right. Linked very closely to this is pick and use a standard nomenclature. What I mean by this is, when it comes to your grammar book and when it comes to notes you make about grammar and a lot of stuff, you should use the same symbols for nouns, action verbs, adjectives, other stuff that you have inside there. If you pick a non-standard nomenclature, when you use other resources, you'll find yourself getting confused very, very easily. So for example, I had a teacher who isn't using the standard up-to-date teaching techniques in Korea when I first learned Korean, which meant for me, an action verb was shortened to AVST. And at the time, that wasn't a problem. The problem came when I came to Korea, and A meant adjective, and all the textbooks will use A as adjective. What it then meant is every time when I started to conjugate things over here and learn new and more advanced grammar rules, I had to stop and think what part I'd actually plug bits into where. So what I recommend using, very highly recommend using, is N for noun, V for action verb, i.e. to do, A for adjective, i.e. to be beautiful. To give you an example of this, in my grammar book or in a note that you'd have on grammar, the past tense polite informal conjugation is A or V, so the A or V plus at, ot, oyo. Now explain obviously in more detail, and once you get into some of the grammar, this will make a lot more sense. But if you write it like this, it'll be in line with standard nomenclature taught in Korea, and it'll make your life in general a lot more simple. All right, next one is learn dictionary form of verbs. And this is one of those other ones that as you get more into the language, you'll understand a bit more what this means. But telling you now, hopefully will stop at least some people from trying to verbatim learn each of the different conjugated forms of verbs. So for example, to go is kara in dictionary form. If you say it in a sentence, so polite informal is kayo, or polite formal is kasamida. Now if you learn kayo, kasamida, kanika, kamika, what you end up doing is you have to rote learn 3 or 4 times or 5 times as much information to get the same thing, firstly. So you're rote learning much more than you need to. The second thing is you stop yourself from learning the skill of conjugating on the fly, and you absolutely need this skill. If you don't have this skill, you won't be able to get past the absolute basic beginner, right, like repeat a single sentence level. So when it comes to verbs, only learn dictionary form, and then as you go, learn the rules for conjugating and practice conjugating on the fly. Trust me, it'll make life a lot more easy as you go on from there. All right, next one, and I'm going to make a specific video for this, and there'll be a tutorial for this specific thing, is use Anki or something similar to learn vocabulary. What this does and what this program does is it's like a flashcard program, but it's on computer, or there's an app on both Apple and Google Play Store which link back to the computer website. And what it does, unlike standard flashcards, which you have to obviously shuffle yourself and maintain and all the rest of it, it alters the frequency that you see the cards based upon how easy or how difficult you find each of the cards. And like I said, I'll explain this in a lot more detail in the specific tutorial for it. But at the moment, my big bit is that I highly, highly recommend it. It is one of, if not the best way to learn vocabulary for another language, especially when it comes to Korean. Also, what I recommend, whenever you do a vocab session, do a vocab session first. So go through on Anki or your flashcards and go through everything. Once you get to the end of the session, do a grammar revision session. It doesn't have to be a long one, but what you then do is take the words you've learnt, the new words or the words you've just revised, and make sentences using selected grammar with it. What it does, number one, it reinforces both the vocab and the grammar, but it also helps you with skills like conjugating on the fly and cement some of these skills a lot more easily. So, for example, one of the first sentences you should be learning is the go sentence, i.e. hakyoe kayo, which means go to school. What you can then do is, when you learn other places, throw the other place into it and say, I went to the movies, I went to my friend's house, and thus practice the words, practice the grammar in these sort of ways. Next one is don't drop particles when learning Korean. Now, if you watch dramas, if you watch TV shows, movies, or you talk to some Koreans, you'll note that they do drop particles. But when it comes to learning Korean, you need to practice particles. And if you drop particles in conversation, especially early on, you're going to make things a lot more difficult for yourself in terms of practicing these skills. Additionally, when it comes to the TOPIK test, which if you're wanting to learn Korean for anything else bar understanding K-pop or dramas, you're going to want to sit the TOPIK test, then you need to use particles. Absolutely need to use particles, especially when it comes to written things. So I highly recommend, right from the start, always use particles. It also means whenever you're talking to Korean, if you use a particle incorrectly, they're likely to be say, hold it, it's this particle instead of that particle, which helps reinforce some of these bits and also allows mistakes in understanding to be detected, fixed, so you can move on. Lastly, absolutely do not learn Romanized Korean. If you're going to learn Korean and you're going to take the effort of learning Korean, right from the start, learn Hangul. So for example, 화장실이 어디예요? Which means, where's the toilet, in short. Now you can see, obviously, Korean can be written in like what you look like English, which is Romanized form. The problem with learning this is, when you go to Korea, nothing's Romanized. Like, not nothing. There are some street signs which will be Romanized, especially in Seoul, but everything else is in Hangul, number one. So if you can't read Hangul, it's very, very difficult then to be able to even put stuff into your translator to be able to like, what does this say? What's this menu item? Number two, you end up sounding weird because Hangul is not a one-for-one, I guess, switch for the Romanized alphabet or English alphabet, which means it's only an approximation if it's written in Romanized form. Thus, if you read it out directly as that, and I'm not even going to read that second sentence in Romanized form because I just can't. You sound really, really strange to Korean speakers. You're liaising, so where sounds travel from one syllable to another, is wrong and sounds wrong. And you end up sounding at best strange, at worst not able to be understood at all. So right from the start, don't do it. Just do not learn Romanized Korean. Forget about it. Hell, blank it out in the little translator books if you've got, if that makes it easier for you to not do it. Practice the Hangul. There are a lot of really good videos on YouTube from native speakers about the Hangul and what it is. It'll take you at most, if you give it a good effort, a weekend to learn it. And once you've got it, it'll be with you the whole time, and it's incredibly easy. All right, guys. So they're just some brief tips to help you out as you start this journey. The series will go from here, starting with beginner videos all the way up to advanced. Each of the videos, as I said earlier, is designed to be short, sharp, to the point. This one's a bit longer and a lot longer than I would want, and a lot longer than any of the other ones will be. But the whole idea is that you should be able to watch it, go, yep, cool, understood it, listen to a couple of examples, and then what I recommend at the end of that is take some of the vocab you've just practiced, throw it into those sentences and give it a crack. With that, if you can find yourself a couple of good Korean friends or Korean speakers, go practice once you've practiced with yourself. All right, guys, from here, good luck. Good luck with the journey. I hope to be able to help you along the way. If you've got any comments, throw them down below and I'll get onto them as soon as possible. But otherwise, have yourselves a good and safe day.